So I
Yeah.
always enjoy being part of the community.
Absolutely, yeah. And it's a pleasure to finally do one. I do a lot of these as well, but I don't think I've ever done one with you, Emerald. So it's a real pleasure. I'm Patrick O'Reilly. I'm the founder and chief of product here at CyberSaint Security. And Emerald, back in the day, really helped us to understand some of the implications around the global privacy regulations that were coming out, helped us think through what frameworks might look like here as the state regulations were released. And I'm excited to jump into some of the discussion here. So we've got a few questions for you, Emerald, and I'll kick into the first one here. So, you know, in today's interconnected digital landscape, how would you define the evolving relationship between cyber risk management and privacy protection? And what are the tenets of a successful privacy program, and how do they play with cyber?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think one of my privacy peers actually had a great quote today. I just saw it pass by on LinkedIn. She's actually the head of privacy at eBay, and she was saying, you can't have privacy without security. You can't have security without privacy. And she's completely correct. But I think maybe starting with what you kind of need might be a good place to start in terms of a team, because at the end of the day, a lot of it really depends on how good your people are. Like, you have to work together, and this is especially true for privacy and security teams. Like, I think, first of all, within a privacy team, you really need a multidisciplinary team. I think a lot of people historically, and maybe a little bit more elitist lawyer types, I studied law, so I'm allowed to say this. Like, they were like, you have to be a lawyer to work in privacy. I've actually always thought that was the wrong thing. Maybe it's because I had a software company. I think in order to be successful, you need tools that can scale, but you also need people who can actually understand the technology very well, but also business very well. Because if you want to be effective, you can't be the team that always says no, right? Do we have an audio issue? Oh no, it's gone.
Yeah, there's typical.
There's someone building. Oh, that's fine. I was wondering what it was.
Yeah, there's a mower outside my window. Yeah,
that's totally fine. So I was saying that you also need business acumen, and I think that's actually something that's really underrated and something that I go around and talk about a lot, particularly because people always like, no, when you present a place, no one wants to hear like Article 28 of the GDPR is about contracts. No one wants to hear this. But I actually think at the end of the day, when people come to you with, you know, whatever they want to launch into the world that will be used by real people with real information and real data, they want to know what they have to do to get it to be able to launch safely, compliantly, and obviously successfully, and how to remain in the market in such a way. And I think being able to speak to them in their own language is really important. I recently finished up at Stanford. I kind of did like a mini 1-year MBA thing there, not because I had no business skills, but I actually think it's important to kind of know what's current and what are these people thinking about, so you can talk to them in an articulate way that is meaningful to them. So the second thing I would say is that a strategy is not a plan, and a plan is not a strategy. You often hear people conflating these two things, but you need to start with a solid strategy, and your plan is basically just a bunch of stuff that you're doing. A strategy is basically a set of outcomes that you want to achieve. You can't boil the ocean. So you need to figure out what your priorities are and where you're going to go first. And having, again, probably a reasonable business brain teaches you these things, right? And I think, I'm sure many of you have some connection to entrepreneurship, or have friends that are entrepreneurs, or maybe parents or other family members. But it's really interesting to like learn from these people, because a lot of those basic principles translate really well into creating a strategy or a privacy strategy particularly for larger corporations, because global compliance is hard. It's really big and it's complicated. So you need to figure out, okay, what are we doing? And then your plan will help you determine what are you doing first. And then, of course, I think strong partnerships are really essential. Like, there are critical overlap pieces between privacy and security. Like, breach readiness is obviously a critical one of those. But I think particularly now, well, this has always been true, but I think vendor risk management is a big one. But I think particularly in the world of AI and generative AI tools in particular, this is becoming increasingly important, because for a lot of these tools, you don't need an enterprise license, or an enterprise license doesn't even exist until for some bigger ones quite recently. But What are you going to do if people just start logging in and putting data into that? Like, where does it go? Do you know? Does anyone else know? So I think having joint strategies on these types of items, and at least being joint forces on these matters, because obviously it's so popular and so hyped that you might get a bit of pushback, and being some like united unit can be very effective there.
Great. I love how you frame it in terms of, being able to communicate with the business side, and going to a program like an MBA program just to sort of, get your head around some of what the concerns are on the business side, because as experts, in regulation and frameworks and controls, we can get quickly lost in the weeds. And one of the things we try to do at Cybersane is to make sure that we've got that top layer of communicating to the business. So as an expert in privacy throughout your career, you've seen the rapid evolution of data breaches and their impacts. You've been on the scene. Could you share an example of a real world incident that underscores the critical link between effective cyber risk management and preserving privacy?
Yeah, it's hard to have this conversation without mentioning the Cambridge Analytica debacle, right? Like, we all know major cyber breaches. Like, we've seen the payouts, the class actions, we've seen them all. But I think why Cambridge Analytica was different was because you saw the convergence of privacy and security, but you also basically were slapped in the face with the far-reaching consequences of something going horribly wrong, right? And this started all with something reasonably basic, where if you were a person on Facebook taking personality tests, your data would be shared with this third party, but also your friend's data became part of that. And if you were the friend, you didn't know where your data had gone and that it was part of that data sharing piece. And then that data was probably never deleted. And then eventually was, due to a series of events, which you're all probably familiar of, because I believe there's even a Netflix documentary now called The Social Dilemma. It ended up being used for purposes for which you might not expect it to be used. Obviously, you see a whole bunch of things going wrong here, right? So the whole notice and consent piece is broken, because if one person consents, it doesn't mean that all of these other people consented too. They didn't. The notice piece did not exist at all, because all of these friends had no idea where their data went. And if data ends up being accessed without authorization, it's a serious security problem. So I think it's a place where you saw real convergence, but then obviously, because particularly here in the EU, and I know this happened in the US as well, but it became a whole, I guess, Brexit investigation happened off the back of it. It became a whole PR nightmare for everybody involved. And I think particularly for those users who were affected by it, I think it was also really shocking. And because it's been one of the catalysts that caused some of this thinking about why both privacy and security matter. It made it kind of go more mainstream, because all of a sudden it was about you as well, right? Because I think it was almost 90 million, like 80 something million individuals that were affected by that. That's a huge number. And also people who were like, how would I have known? I'd never signed up for this. And I think because it ended up in a space where it affected certain civil rights, I think it became very real for people. Other than, your data was compromised, please change your password, is not as real as something where you have a direct connection to civil rights.
Excellent. Just trying to get the lawn equipment to quiet down here a bit.
That's all right.
Yeah.
I'm sure the audience is a very friendly one.
Oh, I'm sure. And I'm sure they've dealt with some of those audio issues themselves as well. Fascinating that you bring up Cambridge Analytica. I think that's a wonderful example for the nexus of privacy and technology. Can you elaborate on some practical approach? Because this is what we talked to you years ago about, right? As GDPR and CCPA were coming out, it was sort of, how do you frame the conversation, initially? You can point to the law, and you're a lawyer and you're very comfortable pointing to the law. And I'm someone who builds frameworks, so I'm very comfortable looking at line items and coming up with ways to deal with it. But how do you, how can you be practical for professionals and ensure data protection without stifling technological progress? Because that's a huge concern.
Yeah, I think it's a really great question, and I think privacy has a bit of an unfair reputation in that, and security probably as well, but in privacy a little bit more because people find pure compliance conversations often quite painful. And I understand. I've been doing this for a while, but I think we are seeing a change in thinking where privacy is starting to be seen as something that can actually be an asset. And people don't like buying from companies who they perceive as being creepy. And I believe there's quite a few of them now that have been in the market and have had stories saying that they are a little bit creepy. So I think that's one piece of it. But I think, very practically speaking, make sure you're part of the tech teams. Be in their meetings. You don't be the no police, because nobody likes them. Try to actually be part of the business conversation that happens. Like, particularly with product teams, they often have a weekly discussion. I always love hearing what's going on because I'm a commercial person. I'm interested. I want to hear how these people are thinking about new products and what the strategy is and what the go-to-market will look like. It will also help you not be like this external tick box, but rather be integrated and have that privacy and security by design. You have the mandatory processes, right? Like privacy impact assessments, things like that. They become less painful if you actually really understand what's going on, because you had a seat at the table. So I think having good people skills is, again, really critical. And soft skills are always seen as less than. I actually think they're way more important. Anyone can Google something. AI is coming for everyone's job, except they're not coming for your soft skills, because that's hard to do for a computer. We have those. So I think that's really important. There's no point in watching on from the sidelines, is what I'm saying. Then I think you have a bit of a job to do in terms of reputational fixing, right? Which is, often the law does not say you cannot do things. It usually says if you're going to do these things, you have to do all of these other things too. So, for example, if you're going to collect all of this data that you might not necessarily need to deliver this product to market, then you might need consent for this extra data, which just means you need to go and seek that. It might say you need to provide meaningful information to the user. You can do that in a variety of ways, innovative and some not so innovative, like a privacy policy, ideally one that's really readable in layman's terms. But usually it's not that you can't do things. It's rather, if you're going to do this, these are the principles you need to adhere to as you're doing them. And I think that's a privacy reputational thing that still needs to be worked on a little bit, I think, on a global and industry level.
Excellent.
Um, what else was I going to say? Oh, yeah, this is like the most practical thing I'm going to say. Make sure your processes are clear and not too tedious. If you can build self-service portals, things like that, that's one thing we've done, is like have like a DIY self-service portal where people can go and say, okay, I have this new thing. Here's some of the basic information. Do I need a DPIA here? Yes or no? The pricing team responds based on that initial input, and that way there's a clear workflow. And if you can do that in, I guess, in a cross-functional way, because a lot of departments need the same information, that's probably utopia, right? Where you don't have multiple questionnaires, you just have the one. It gets fanned out to different departments. Everyone gets the information they need, and it gets action that way. But try to make it the least painful as possible. And I think that over time will hopefully ease people's thinking a little bit on in respect of data protection and privacy being painful. It doesn't have to be painful.
I love cross functional and efficient. That's a wonderful answer. So, gonna bring up something. I was on a session earlier today about this, but I want to hear your thoughts on it. As businesses increasingly rely on third-party partnerships and cloud services, how does a privacy leader assess and manage the associated cyber risk to safeguard user data and privacy?
Yeah, this is exactly one of those places where you need strong partnerships, right? Like, I think the first step is to make sure that this vendor has really solid security. There's no point in proceeding. So you need your security experts to actually do an assessment of these third parties. And I'm sure that came up in your conversation too. I think then the way I see it is that there's different measures you put in place, right? There is, I guess, the more hard evaluation measure that a security team might do. And then there's some other, I guess, protective measures you might do from a legal and privacy standpoint. So one key privacy / legal one is obviously contractual guarantees. Now, in the Netherlands, we have a saying, and it translates quite poorly to "you can't pluck a bald chicken," but basically it means if your vendor's broke, if your contract says we can come and get all your money if there's a terrible breach, it's not super helpful, which is why that prior assessment is so critical. But I still think contractual guarantees have their place. They're also mandatory under many privacy laws. And then I think making sure that also contractually there is a right to audit, and making sure that that re-audit actually happens, right? It's great to have a right to audit, but if no one in the vendor might be used for 15 years, a lot can change in terms of security posture in those 15 years. So making sure that there's actually more continuous evaluation and management of the vendors, which is quite a difficult thing to do, I think, for many organizations, because I used to be a consultant as well. So I've seen quite a few companies, and I think many of them are large. So you just need to make sure that you have really solid processes in place to make sure that that actually happens.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that was what we were discussing, automating third and fourth party vendor risk, because as you say, it's very difficult, and you don't want to get stuck on too much point in time analysis. So the human element, and you're kind of a master in this area, remains a vulnerability in cybersecurity. How can privacy programs cultivate a culture of privacy awareness and responsibility among employees?
Make it fun. Don't make it annoying and tedious. Like, this is like really the one thing that I'm actually really passionate about, because I think one of my first blogs that I don't know, this was a long time ago now. I think this was in the time where cloud computing was taking off, and I had written a paper on data fragmentation and the data protection issues around that. This must have been 2012, maybe earlier, around that time anyway. And I had a blog that was like cloudgirl.eu. This was when I was still a girl and not aging. But it was called cloud compliance in layman's terms or something. I like things in layman's terms in a way that's not boring. So I like memes. I like themes for things, and I can give you one really concrete example of what we actually do at Logitech, which is we've partnered with the cybersecurity team and the product security team every year, and we run like a massive internal conference, and it goes on for a couple of weeks. And like the CEO opens that conference for us, and he says a few words, and we have like a lot of support from across the business, and we do a whole bunch of stuff. So there is the oatmeal section of the conference, which is, this is the stuff you kind of have to cover, like obviously some mandatory trainings, things like a general privacy training, vendor management. This is where you go, privacy impact assessments, security training, all the basics that you'll all be very familiar with. But what we also like to do is have some like interest workshops on newer topics, current topics, guest speakers. We give away prizes, we have quizzes. Every year we have a theme. So we try to kind of utilize a bit of, I guess, what is currently in pop culture and relevant to make things more relatable. And we try to deliver it with a little bit of life as well. So it's not like just droning on about what the GDPR said. Like, those people kind of know. So I think that's try and get creative with how you get people involved. There's obviously some of the basic things that you can do as well. And I'm sure you're very familiar with security champions, privacy champions across the business. I think this really works very well if those people are, I guess, volunteering for this and there's something in it for them. It can be great from a career development point of view to take something extra on, things like that. What might work less well is if you're being appointed, because then it becomes something that you have to do. So I think finding people who already have some affinity with what you're trying to achieve is great. But what I found in the past, I was actually talking to my own team about this today, was that a lot of the times this stuff happens quite organically. If you're communicating about these topics in the right way, there's people who will be sitting at a table and go, hey, what about security? Or hey, what about privacy? Because they just have a natural interest in it for whatever reason. So those kind of privacy and security champions might kind of get organically created in your business, where you just have a bunch of go-to people that you regularly go to for support. But I think the last point I'm going to make on that is it needs to be an ongoing thing. You can't go from day one, I have no culture that takes this into account, to then doing a few trainings and being like, oh, I wonder why there's no culture here now. I think you need to continuously invest in this. But the most important thing is make it fun and try not to make it tedious for people, because no one likes a tedious training. It's just what it is.
I love it. I love it. Yeah. Making it fun. That's what we're all about over here as well. At least I hope so. So I'm going to shift a little here just to talk about IoT and smart devices. So how does a privacy leader approach sort of the unique challenges posed by interconnected products that gather and transmit data?
It depends whether I'm approaching this as a consumer or as a professional. I'll probably go into this as a professional. I think one of the most important things is that people know what's going on. If I can, like, I often have to explain privacy to people very briefly. And the way I usually do that is people should never be surprised to learn how their data is being processed. It should never be a surprise to them. So let's say you get a subject access request from a consumer, their data gets sent to them. It should be in line with their expectations, right? And I think this is particularly true for IoT devices. First of all, I would again lean very heavily on my security colleagues, particularly the product security colleagues, because they're the experts in this. And where, like, usually it goes wrong on the security side first, and then it becomes a privacy issue in this particular case. And then I think from a privacy standpoint, I think there's quite a lot you can do in terms of giving people meaningful notice and consent. And I think a lot of that happens, of course, in your privacy policy, but there's also a thing called like just-in-time notices that as data is going to be collected, it might not be all at once, right? It might be as you enable certain features, you can give people some more information on, okay, you're now enabling this, or now this is being connected to that. Understand that this means there's this type of data sharing going on, or it, there's those types of things. And I think trust is a huge concern in this particular space. And I think we have all read those examples of certain IoT devices sending recordings to the wrong people. And there's been loads of nightmare situations there. So I think obviously starting with amazing security, making sure nothing that the user does not expect is happening. Right. And then the second thing is making sure that people understand what is happening at all times with their information. I think control is one thing, but understanding what's happening is equally important.
Yeah, and you sort of hit it there. You hit a couple of dimensions, so can you say anything additional on how technology and business leaders communicate privacy practices to users, and how do you build that trust?
I can. I think, first of all, use clear, regular people language. You need to meet people where they are, and you need to understand your customers. Because, like, you talk very differently to, someone who sits in an office all day to somebody who might be a bit younger and plays games a lot. You know what I mean? Understand your customer. Also, if you can, match your language to all your other language. Right? Like, it's weird to have, for example, quite casual communication on your website, and then all of a sudden have a super legalese privacy policy. That, the marketing people generally really understand the customer. This is literally their job to understand, right? So if you can at least match your language, like, it needs to be true, meaningful, and completely compliant. Of course, I do want to stress that, but don't start throwing in a bunch of references to laws that don't need to be in there per se. Make sure that it's easy to understand. And I also think it's really helpful to provide summaries of things, making sure your privacy controls within your applications are easy to understand and read. Make sure you're, like, this is like a very basic thing, but make sure that your little toggles for switching things on and off are easy to find. Ideally, don't turn them on by default. So privacy by design and most private by default is always best, particularly if you're looking for trust. And if privacy is something that you want to have as your competitive advantage, then that's definitely something you should be considering. And then lastly, I would say have a think about where privacy sits in your strategy, at least business wise. Because I know there are companies out there that are now very openly talking about privacy and how you should buy their products because they're more private. And I think as more, just to kind of, I guess, link back to the previous question, as more things get connected to the internet, that's going to become more and more important, because it only takes one mistake or one bad thing to happen to your company for that trust to really take a hit. And it's hard to recover from that from a reputational standpoint.
Absolutely, absolutely. I love the focus on, you know, complexity and boiling it down to the human element. It's critical in our space, and you know, it's, you know, storytelling is essential to what we do. You know, so the regulatory landscape, and I deal with this, surrounding data privacy is constantly evolving. It's changing all the time. So how does a privacy leader proactively adapt measures to stay compliant with emerging regulations while also staying ahead of potential risks?
I think that is that's the forever question, because I think it's something that's really hard for anyone, particularly if I have a global role, right? So I think the first thing to understand, particularly it depends on where you're starting from, but I'm going to approach this question and assuming you've just become the head of privacy somewhere and you need to set it up, right? Like, go. Then I think what you need to do first is make sure your basics are done right. Because a lot of these laws, and also laws that will happen in the future, they all have a lot of very basic things in common. And I think from a data and from a security standpoint, those are things you should probably do anyway. Things that come to mind are have solid data governance, know what data resides in your organization, make sure you know how to deal with data subject rights, and make sure you have a process for that. Understanding your data flows, make sure that you have a good breach response plan, make sure that that breach response plan has been tested and you know that it works. So all of these things exist in most privacy laws at some sort of level, right? I think what we often find is that when we look at all of these laws globally, we do either one of two things. We think they're all dramatically different, or they're all, or many of them are exactly the same. Neither of those is usually true. It's usually they have certain things that are the same, and then they have their own kind of idiosyncrasies that are just a little bit different that you might need to comply with. And this brings us back to the strategy conversation that we had, right? So let's say you've done those basic things, but you now know, because you have great relationships with the business, because you've done your business knowledge, you have great relationships with them, you meet with them often, you now know that this particular region over here is a focus area. Then once you have those basics, you can start zooming in on, okay, we've done this basic compliance work now and solid foundations. Now what do we do in terms of what do the local laws? Are there anything different things that we should be doing that we're not currently doing? And then you can obviously zoom in on that. Or it might be that you're in a particular industry as opposed to region. Are there any industry specific laws that you need to be aware of that say something maybe a little bit more or a little bit different that you now need to hone in on? But it kind of comes down to, you can't boil the ocean. So I think having very solid foundation everywhere is a really good place to start from both a privacy and a security standpoint.
Amazing. Really, really, really good stuff. So we're getting close to time, and you have really laid out some very practical, very sort of battle-tested approaches to, you know, socializing, you know, security and privacy across an organization. I just want to hear sort of your future visions on things here a little bit. So I'll give you one last question here. Looking ahead, what emerging trends do you foresee at the crossroads of cyber risk management and privacy, and how should organizations prepare to address those challenges proactively?
All right. So, first things first, it will stay hard. So I think one thing that people need to be more honest about, and I try to do this wherever I speak, is even though I've been doing this for a long time now, it remains really difficult, and it remains something that you need good colleagues to work with in order to get full coverage, right? So if it feels challenging to you at times, it's normal and it'll probably stay that way. Then I think tooling and automation remain critical. Like if we need to scale, most people are not going to get 1,000 privacy and security people on their team, even though you might need it, because the world of data is just changing so rapidly and the scale of data collection is increasing so rapidly. So we need tooling and automation. That's definitely a trend that's going to stay. Privacy tech, I think, is still in its infancy. I think there's a lot to be done. I think if we can get to solutions that actually work cross-functionally, that would be amazing. I think a lot of companies still have to have a tech stack where they have certain tools for security, certain tools for privacy, certain tools for procurement, for all of these other business areas, but there's not something that works for everyone that does everything that you need it to do. And I think there's still a whole room for improvement, for innovation. And then the last thing I think is privacy specific is I'm seeing a real convergence of privacy and AI governance or AI compliance or whatever you want to call it. We're going to see careers evolving. We're going to see new areas end up with the people who are already there. So I am picking up quite a lot of AI governance. I'm really interested in it. I think there's a lot of overlap between both privacy, security, and what's happening in AI. It's hard to use these technologies and not consider both of those disciplines because they're really exciting, but they also come with a tremendous risk. So I think the future is bright for privacy and security people who are willing to do the work.
Absolutely. Well, Emerald, as usual, fascinating, edifying, great to see you again. And to the audience, I hope you enjoyed her expertise. It's always been beneficial to us. We've worked with her quite a bit. And I want to thank you, Emerald, for joining today, and we'll be signing off.